think that I actually know almost everybody here. I'm Jean Stellman, the president of EPIC, and I'm only going to say hello and welcome and thank Volker for all the effort and thinking that he puts into organizing our EPIC conversations that take place twice a year, usually accompanied by a really nice luncheon and a little wine, but we should be thankful that we have this. Okay, he comes prepared. Okay, so Volker, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jean. And I think I would also like to thank you and Diana that you've kept us together in this crisis. And I think we have had a very full program. And I was very pleased that you were prepared to continue to be our president. And I hope you will continue forever. Well, I would like to welcome Peter and Gillian. This is, I believe, our 7th conversation, and it's always been very lively, as those of you who will have attended the earlier ones, and it's always been very informative, I think, for all of us. And that is also true today, because we will be talking about some very topical things also that have concerned all of us. So I certainly look forward. But let me introduce, first of all, Peter very briefly. He's had quite an amazing career, I think. He got his BA at Harvard in 1961. Then he got his Yale Law degree in 1964. And it seems in the 1960s, Peter, you probably had a little bit of Fernweh, as it's called in German, and you actually went to Ethiopia, to the university there, but eventually you came back, worked for the Office of the Solicitor General, and were involved in some cases, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. And then, of course, you joined the Columbia Law School in 1971, were on leave in 1975 to 1977 to work for the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And you specialized from the very beginning, I think, in administrative law. And in 1987, you were recognized for your achievements by the American Bar Association that gave you an award of distinguished service in administrative law. Now, you then traveled a lot. You were involved in various administrative law projects, also in the EU, and they certainly always needed a lot of administrative help, I think. And you were invited to the European University Institute in Florence. You went to Buenos Aires. You had visiting appointments at Hong Kong, at Rome University, Munich, the MPI for Comparative and International Law, McGill, Sorbonne, Tokyo, Sydney. So it's a very long list, and you were really a very cosmopolitan traveler. In short, you are a scholar and teacher of truly international reputation, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for agreeing to join this conversation.
Thanks so much.
Your interlocutor will be Gillian Metzger, who is the Fisk Stone Professor of Constitutional Law at our law school here at Columbia. She got her BA at Yale and a BPhil at Oxford, and I wonder whether she almost would have stayed over there, but she came back and got her JD at Columbia University here in 1966, teaching since then administrative law, editing several books, and in 2015 winning a prize, again, like Peter, of the American Bar Association for Distinguished Service. She was a faculty director of the Columbia Center for Constitutional Governance, is an excellent teacher and got the Rees Prize in 2014 for her teaching in the law school, was Vice Dean of the Columbia Law School, and it should not be forgotten that for a while she also clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She is currently on leave from Columbia as a senior counselor in the Department of Justice. And no doubt she will also tell you about her new work for the Biden administration. So thank you again, both of you, for coming. We are all straining to listen to your conversation. You have about 40 minutes or so, but you decide when you feel you want to hand over for a question and answer period, where that we've always had. And I think those who are in the audience will then please click into their Zoom facility so that Jean and also Diana can direct questions that we hope to have. So thank you again for coming, and I look forward to this very exciting conversation between the two of you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Volker, very much. Well, I'm really delighted to be here as interlocutor or participant in a conversation with my very distinguished senior colleague and mentor and friend, Peter Strauss. Volker mentioned that I am currently on government leave, so I should say at the outset that whatever I say is, of course, in my personal capacity. So Volker, you recounted many of Peter's many achievements. You know, he has been for decades one of the nation's leading administrative and constitutional law scholars, a hugely prolific author with scholarship that has really just framed central debates in our field. Your description didn't mention as much that he's been a wonderful teacher to generations of Colombians, and he has also been a wonderful senior colleague. I have really benefited mightily from his very generous support of his junior colleagues over the years, including asking me to join him as an editor of the leading administrative law casebook, Gellhorn and Weiss's Administrative Law, and throwing all sorts of opportunity my ways when I was a very junior scholar trying to figure out what I was doing. So I'm hugely grateful and really delighted to be here. And I think we will turn to those weighty issues of the day. But this is also my chance to find out from Peter the answer to a number of questions I've always had about his background that I've never, seemed to get a chance to get answered. And one of them has to do going all the way back to when he was at Harvard as an undergraduate. I had no idea that you graduated in chemistry and physics. So how did you end up going on to law school?
Well, there were two things that excited me, or perhaps I should say there were two teachers who excited me in high school. One of them was the social science teacher, debate coach, who got me involved in oral representation and in a mock legislative contest that somehow I did pretty well in. And the other was my chemistry teacher, Dr. Spears. And they both turned me on. Well, okay, so that one of those was going to be my path. And when you go to college, you kind of know that if science is going to be your path, you damn well better start. But if law is going to be your path, you can afford to wait a bit. So I took the freshman soc-sci course I took was with Mark DeWolf Howe, who was a noted legal historian at the Harvard Law School, who introduced me to Plucknett's History of the Common Law, as thick and boring a book as you're likely to find. But mostly I did chemistry and physics. And I did reasonably well at it, but I was also engaged principally, I guess, with management of the Harvard Glee Club. And I found that I was enjoying community building, community activities much more than I was enjoying standing in the laboratory. And as someone who had never seen the collection of law books, which is also intimidating, at one point, I wandered into the Mallinckrodt laboratories at Harvard, the chemistry library, and there was this wall of abstracts, tens of thousands of pages of abstracts, and on each page, 3 PhD projects. And I think I was intimidated, or maybe just discouraged. How am I going to make my mark there? But it was principally that I wasn't enjoying the science that much, and I saw around me colleagues who were getting much more deeply into it, a vision which has been vindicated in a way by seeing their academic and research successes after their graduation. And I took a course with Paul Freund, who was a college course that he offered, who was a legendary a teacher of con law at Harvard, and it just turned me on. To the extent that I got him to agree to give me an independent learning project in the spring of my senior year, and I would trot up to his office every 2 weeks and drop off a paper about the hearings into the security clearance of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and then come back and have him talk to me about it, really not appreciating what an extraordinary opportunity that was. It was an extraordinary opportunity. And he was quite disappointed when I went to Yale and not Harvard, but I had too many ruts in Cambridge.
Gotcha. Right. So then you make it down the Amtrak corridor to New Haven, and you go to Yale for 3 years, but then you go and you work as a law clerk to Chief Judge David Bazelon, one of the leading figures in the development of administrative law at a point when it's really sort of beginning the heyday of some of the emergence of some modern administrative law doctrines. And I guess you clerked for him in 64, 65, was it? And then after that, of course, you go to clerk for Justice Brennan on the Supreme Court. But the move immediately to Bazelon and administrative law, did you get interested in administrative law at Yale? Or was this something, Bazelon being a great judge, you decided to clerk for Bazelon and then the administrative law interest developed?
My Dr. Spears at Yale was a fellow by the name of Charles Reich. And as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, I had the distinct privilege, honor, pleasure of editing a piece of his called The New Property, which is part of the development that reshaped administrative law during the 70s. And I think that was probably important to administrative law. But I want to say that in the mid-60s, when I was in Washington as a law clerk, administrative law wasn't really there yet. It took a while after I was there to get to that point. And I mean, a few years. So where I really got the administrative law as my thing bug was when I got back and into the Solicitor General's office.
Gotcha. That's right. Yeah, I guess there were some beginnings of it in the environmental area, right? You had some slight inklings, but it didn't take off until later in the 60s and early 70s, really. So that I want to talk about the Solicitor General, and I want to talk about your time at the NRC. But Volker mentioned, again, my taking this chance to ask you about all the questions about your past that I've never fully had the answer for. And one of the experiences that that you have that I don't know if all that many people know that much about is that you spent 2 years, 1966 to 68, in Ethiopia as a law professor. And that's not the usual turn. And so how did that come about? And what was it like living in Ethiopia? That was still under Haile Selassie's reign?
It was. So I was, I think, standing in Harvard Square when John Kennedy made the speech in which he announced the idea of the Peace Corps. I mean, that really rang a bell for my generation, particularly in its contrast to Vietnam. And from that point forward, I just knew that I was going to be spending a couple of years abroad doing something in an underdeveloped country, which eventually came to be doing something legally related in an underdeveloped country, and it had to be in English because I didn't have any other languages. And when I was looking around towards the end of, well, in my clerkship with Justice Brennan, I did some searching and found a Ford program that sponsored you to go to law schools in Africa. And Ethiopia had a brand new law school. And it was under the leadership of a man whom I met. He came by to interview and was immediately smitten with. He remains, well, maybe Jillian may be an exception to this proposition, but until the current dean of Yale of Columbia Law School got into place, I have said and firmly believe that Jim Paul was the best dean I ever served with. And that was an experience, one that introduced me to, in some sense, other legal systems, to working with cultures that were having to adopt to strange ways of thinking about the law and adopt those strange ways to their own. And for me, I taught criminal law, not administrative law. But the criminal law I taught was a code that had been written by the dean of the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And it was it was a Swiss watch. It was a very elegant piece of construction and constructed in French. So I had to learn to read law French. That wasn't so hard. But I had to learn to figure out the difference between things like recklessness. I knew what that was about. That's a common law sense. And dolus eventualis, which seems as if it ought to be the same thing as recklessness, but it isn't quite. So there was my introduction to seeing how different legal systems work to resolve the same kinds of problem. You know, that arson, theft, murder, rape exist all over the world, but the ways in which legal systems deal with them differ considerably. And working my students through that and working my own head around that, the different ways of approach, doubtless got me started along the lines of teaching not only about American administrative law, but how American administrative law and other systems interact. And the other thing I did was to edit the English translation of the traditional codex of Ethiopia. The translation was done by a Roman Catholic priest who went on to become Ethiopia's first cardinal. And we worked together for about a year. English was his seventh language, I think, rendering it into somewhat reasonable English. But again, here was an experience with a deeply influential legal system that had been in Ethiopia for centuries, and whose intersection with the Swiss Penal Code, before judges who had grown up with the Fethanagusta and its ideas, and not with the Swiss Penal Code, was a piece of the education.
Sounds super interesting. What was the political climate like? Was it relatively calm, or was it there? Because
it was relatively calm. Students and police didn't get along, and there was a kind of an annual riot in which the police would take it out on these students who were going to be their betters. We had both a day class and a night class. The 82 lawyers we graduated every year were the only lawyers this country of 25 million at the time were going to get. And that gave a certain focus to the faculty's consideration of, well, what does it take to become a lawyer? And how ought we to be training our students? That you don't get when you're one law school out of 167, or in New York City, 1 out of 10 or 11, and your classes are all over the place. But one of the students who had applied to the night program was a bird colonel in the Ethiopian Air Force who'd gotten an American degree from George Ball University. And he was asked on his application form, which I read, to say why he wanted to go to law school. So now I'm answering your question. He said, I've observed that it's become increasingly important for junior officers in African military to have a grounding in the fundamentals of government. And just in case anybody could misunderstand what he was saying, he then listed 8 countries where there had recently been military coups. So you kind of knew that was in the wind. But nothing happened while I was there. Haile Selassie continued to reign. He was really quite revered by his people mostly, and they were waiting for him to expire to show that he was weak. And when he did, there was a coup and some awful years afterwards.
So you come back from that to the U.S. And that's when you spend a few years at the SG's office, and then go on to teach, and then come back to do the NRC job. I have often heard you talk about the NRC job and the importance of getting experience inside government. One of the reasons why I'm so thrilled that I'm getting the chance to do that now. So I'm curious about both of those experiences, what it was like to work in the SG's office at the time, and as you say, time of administrative law taking off in some ways, and what it was also like then later to be at the NRC, and what you learned from both of those, what lasting lessons you took away from those.
Well, thank you. At the NRC, I had actually an interesting return to the new property, to Charles Reich, which marked one of the great transitions that occurred at the time. There was a case came out of New York, actually was litigated by Columbia Law School's quasi-clinic at the time, Goldberg versus Kelly, that challenged the administration of the Social Security of the welfare program in New York. And the question was, well, was the government providing sufficient procedure, sufficient administrative procedure for the determination of some of the issues involved in assessing someone's eligibility for welfare? And was this just a benefit, a privilege, which the government could handle any way that it chose? Or did these people have rights that the government had to respect before it took their welfare privileges away? So that was what the new property was all about. And I got the luck of the draw writing the government's amicus brief in the case. Like New York State, actually, committed to the proposition that yes, process was due. These things were entitlements, and it was about time to recognize entitlements as an element of personal right, as it were, that meant the government had to follow certain procedures before they effected it. We did argue that we thought sufficient procedures had been provided for. This particular case was about the preliminary stages, and all sorts of things had been done that corresponded, if you like, to what in criminal cases is called the determination of probable cause. But Justice Brennan wrote a quite strong opinion saying it wasn't enough. Turned out not to have a very long survival, a lifetime on its specifics, but it created what came to be known as the due process explosion. Mm-hmm. Another case that I was involved in at the time involved the right of individuals, not individuals who were directly subject to government regulation. No one had any doubt that they could get judicial review of government activities affecting them. But suppose a government activity involving someone else affected your interests, your concrete interests. Could you get review whether that action had been proper or not? And the answer to that point was no, you couldn't. And I got to write the government's 2 briefs in associated cases on that subject. The head of the civil division argued the more important of them, and I argued the second of them. The one I argued against someone who became my colleague not so many years afterwards, Harold Edgar, who was there representing this same Columbia outfit that had brought Goldberg versus Kelly, representing clients of this same Columbia outfit that had brought Goldberg versus Kelly, and lost it. I lost it, or the government lost it, and that marked the beginning, really, of opening, I don't know whether to call it the judicial floodgates or not, but opening access to the judiciary to the would-be beneficiaries of government programs in ways that simply hadn't been concrete, or at least as concrete, in previous years. And those stayed with me when I got to Columbia as elements of my administrative law education, if you like, as did a few other things that I encountered in the office. But all of the work there was work looking back at things that had already happened and trying to get judges to agree that, well, it was okay that these things had happened as they did. None of it was involved in planning, none of it was involved in advising, none of it was involved in looking forward at all. It fit beautifully what at the time was the framework for teaching administrative law. Louis Jaffe, who was one of the leading Harvard scholars of the time, had written a book entitled Judicial Control of Administrative Action. And that was a kind of Bible at the time, and that was where the action was. That was generally what got taught. My mentor here, Walter Gellhorn, had presided over inquiries into what agencies actually did and how they did it that were and remain pretty influential and some part of his teaching. But on the whole, administrative law was seen as teaching law students about judicial control of administrative action. And that's what I did when I first got to Columbia. For the first 4 years of my teaching. That's pretty much what I did. And the NRC changed all that. All of a sudden, I had to be advising people about future consequences. All of a sudden, I was engaged with a body that to which the political framework in which they acted was more important than the judicial framework to which they might be exposed and from which I was responsible to help protect them. But they never asked to read any of my briefs or hear about any of my arguments. They wanted my advice on legal questions that confronted them, of course, but all my work for them was preparing for their interactions with Congress, preparing for their work interactions with the White House, preparing for their interactions with staff. And I got a real education on what administrative law was really about. Yeah, judicial control of administrative action, but one of the things that I'm in some sense proudest about was helping get back to where Walter Gellhorn had been in the 1940s. What administrative law students need to be involved with is how administrative agencies act and not how judges control them. And the chapters on judicial control got moved to the back of the book where they belong. And probably the most satisfactory piece of preparing teaching materials that I ever did was the chapter for which I was solely responsible in that edition of the casebook, which was a chapter on the process of decision that started students where they were comfortable with administrative law judges who are sort of like judges, hearing things that are sort of like trials. And still there's an element of comparative law there because they aren't actually trials and they aren't actually judges. And law students who were used to real trials and real judges had to have something to pay attention to the difference between them. But to move from that to the complications of a body making institutional decisions and making institutional decisions about other issues than how do we decide this case was what I built the chapter to do. And I think it helped move the general conversation about administrative law. It was, in any event, very satisfying to me.
No, I think, I mean, I think.
Just to go to where you now are, thank heavens you're in OLC and not at the SG's office. Because by and large, again, I take it, what you're doing, what your office is doing is advising people and looking forward and helping them plan how things might come out 2 or 3 years from now. Not just how do we rescue this thing that's already happened and somebody is challenging.
Right, right. Yeah. So the agency that I am working at is the Department of Justice, but it is particularly this part of the Department of Justice called the Office of Legal Counsel, which does exactly what Peter just described. It provides legal advice to the executive branch, some to the presidency, but a lot to agencies. And yes, you do see how legal advice fits into an overall construct aiming to achieve policy goals and thinking about what the implications are. I think these days, you also have folks who do the defending also involved in those conversations because of the unfortunate trend that you did not succeed in pushing all of administrative law away from judicial review. And there's been so much challenging of administrative action in the course that we'll get to, that you have to sort of think of that earlier on in the process. But I think it really, I don't think it's possible to underscore too much how much you really were a leader on this front. The administrative law over the more recent decades, I would say maybe from the 1990s-ish, you've gotten much more focus on things like regulatory control or with the presidential control over more centralization of regulatory review, and you have more discussion of policymaking, more scholars recognizing that the focus on judicial review can have a real harmful impact on agencies and so forth. But you were really ahead of the curve on that. By the way, another way that you were ahead of the curve, and I just think it deserves real emphasis because it makes me feel a bit like a Luddite, which is that Peter has always been a big emphasizer on the importance of technology and how technology may transform government and how technology may affect law, and trying to integrate that into his teaching. And I'm pretty sure that when people take your administrative law class, that's not what they're necessarily expecting is going to be one of the themes that they get. They get no technology from me, by the way, because as I said, I'm a bit of a Luddite. All right,
So
but that actually then brings us to
Can I say a couple of things in response?
Sure, yeah.
One thing is, one of the first conversations I had when I got to the NRC was with the executive director of legal services, who was basically the lawyer for the staff. I was the lawyer for the commission. And he said to me, Peter, a really important thing for you to work at and understand is you cannot let the legal tag wag the policy dog. And that was a good lesson that stayed with me. I hope I was reasonably successful at it. And the other thing I'll say is I think if not the most profound change, certainly one of the most profound changes in government in recent years has been what I'll call the move from the paper age to the digital age. It has reshaped our classrooms too in other senses, right? There are all these students sitting out there with smartphones and you don't know who's talking to who and whether they're shopping on eBay or whatever is going on. But the move from paper to electrons has dramatically reshaped the internal workings of government as well as citizens' relations with the government. It used to be that the agencies were where all the paper was. And because the agencies were where all the paper was, if you think information is power, in their relationship to the White House, they had a lot of power. All that information is in the cloud now.
Mhm.
And the White House has equal access to it. And that's a good part of what's been happening in the transition from a government in which the president acts essentially as overseer of the many diverse agencies of government to a presidency that tries to be in control of what everyone's doing.
Right. Well, let's take the two pieces there. One is sort of the classroom transformations, and then the administrative transformations, because you have a great perspective on both Columbia and legal academia, having been the Betts Professor of Law at the law school for over 4 decades. So you've seen how legal education, legal academia have developed, but also how Columbia has really changed. So, I mean, if you were to think back on Columbia, what do you think the biggest transformations have been in your many years at the school?
Well, I'll answer it, but I also see that we're getting preciously close to, if not past,
Okay.
the 40-minute part that Volker suggested. Faculty growth and specialization, administrative growth, and its impact on faculty governance. And I've seen that directly at the law school, but I suspect that it's true across the campus. And I would say, again, the impacts of the digital age. It has changed the way our students learn. It has changed in some ways the balance of power in the classroom, because our students come to us considerably more expert, at least for old fogies like me. Our students come to us considerably more expert and more capable of using its resources or being distracted by its resources than we are. There's a terrific book. I guess for Emeriti, it's not so important to advertise it, by a woman now at CUNY, at the graduate CUNY faculty, named Kathy Davidson, called The New Education, in which she works to identify ways in which the transition from paper education, or for that matter, the Chautauqua era, to digital education can be made real. And I learned a great deal from her. My teaching in some ways was transformed by some of the ways in which she suggested one could deal with the disappearance of the conventional classroom. We start with the notion that there are all our students out there listening to me, or in the legal law school context, listening to their colleagues answer questions that the professor has posed to them. And listening is not a strong suit in the current generation of students. You have to find ways to engage them. And Kathy Davidson, I think, effectively for me, pointed in that direction.
Please,
Well, this year has. Volker?
We've only, we started late, so please go ahead, and I'm sure you've got a number of very important questions still.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I was just going to say, following up on that, Peter, I mean, this year has really, I think, moved academia in some ways light years ahead on those issues. There's always, and I speak from personal experience, you know, you always know there's so many more interesting, creative ways you could teach, but it's a lot of upfront costs. And, you know, if you think that the tried and true works, basically, it's hard to invest. But then you have a pandemic and you have to invest, and you have to really figure out the technology and make it work. And I think that actually, I'm hoping that will be a lasting benefit of this last year of people using technology, engaging students, and teaching in many different ways, so that it's not just the traditional format.
I share that.
Yep.
And particularly in the law school context, the use of what Zoom calls breakout rooms. what I got to do in my teaching in all my Zoom classes. I would have maybe three breakout rooms a class, different identities in each room, 3 or 4 students who had to talk about issues. That's Davidson's point about engagement. You have to find ways of getting your students aware that they've got to be up to conversations. And instead of just one conversation at a time going on, there'd be 20 conversations at a time going on. And students would know, I got to be ready to talk about these issues that Strauss is going to make us talk about, because what happened in the Red Sox game is not so interesting.
Well, that depends on whether or not you're a Red Sox fan, but yes. So let's move now more substantive. It really has been an extraordinary few years to be an administrative law professor. It's been an extraordinary few years with what has happened in government, culminating in January 6th. So many issues that Peter have been central to your scholarship, that are central to the field, about particularly the scope of presidential authority. How do you preserve accountability and also have constraints? The relationship between the different branches of government and the effect that political polarization has had on our entire government system ability to operate. So, I mean, maybe we could just start with your views on sort of the current state of American administrative government, and then move from there to the constitutional system writ large. What do you see as the major issues?
So I can start with a minor advertisement. The summer issue of Daedalus is going to be the magazine of the American Association of Arts and Sciences. Is Academy of Arts and Sciences is going to be dedicated to just the questions that you've asked. And as I recall, you have a piece in there, and I have a piece in there which is entitled "How Did We Get Here?" And people might be interested in that. The reason I've put this statue in front of the law school, that's in front of the law school, Jacques Lipschitz's Bellerophon Taming Pegasus, in front of you, is that it captures this moment for me. I mean, it has long captured what the law school is about. The metaphor is reason taming unreason. And that's law's work in society. And if you look at the sculpture closely, particularly if you can get up to the 5th floor and look at it from the back, you see that Lipschitz joined Pegasus with Bellerophon's head. Bellerophon doesn't actually have a head, or to put it another way, Pegasus, the wild horse of unreason, is his head. It's his own unreason that he's taming, which makes it a really wonderful sculpture to grace a law school. And the problem of the past 4 years has been that Pegasus is wriggling free. And we can hope that the present administration will get him back under the golden leash, under Athena's golden leash of reason. But there are a whole range of developments, not least of them a Senate Majority Leader who seems to be taking the position 100% opposition to this president, who says that he's talking about bipartisanship, to think that a great deal of what's been troubling us for the past 4 years is going to continue to trouble us. Ornstein and Mann years ago described Congress as the broken branch. And then the next edition of their book was, it's worse than it looks. And then the third edition of their book was, it's worse than it was. And then one has books like How Democracies Die, coming out of Harvard, about the current trends towards autocracy. And all of these I find troublingly echoing things that are happening in our society, and it's been a little hard for me to see easy ways out. To take one example, one of the things that Donald Trump very clearly did was to continue what had been a trend, not only towards presidential authority from the White House, but towards much greater politicization of the bureaucracy. They did this in a variety of ways. And one of the ways he did it was by taking loyalty to be the sine qua non of holding a position from which you could be dismissed without civil service protection. And there are a lot of government employees who don't have civil service protection, but who expect to serve from administration to administration. Most government lawyers, notably the inspectors general, who are policemen inside each government agency, looking after their regularity, and they have traditionally served from administration to administration. Not quite as much as the Librarian of Congress, who lasted from the first President Bush through President Obama. But still, they didn't leave office when the administrations changed. Well, Trump fired a really substantial number of them, and for evidently political reasons, and appointed his friends in their place. And now President Biden's in office. Is there any way that he will effectively be able to replace these political actors with actors who are observably and believably apolitical, so that a Republican successor to him, who is minded to see inspectors general as instruments of solid, honest government, will leave them in office? Or have we created just a new thickening of the political layer? It's so much thicker in American government than almost anywhere else in the world. In France, with a civil service of millions, there are 200 presidential appointees. In the United States, there are over 8,000. And that's a good deal of where our difficulty lies.
So we have.
Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so we have that deep politicization of the government here, but the other thing that we have is increasing loss of trust in the government, and so do you see those two as connected, or because it's not clear? I agree with you that sometimes the path forward is not obvious, but particularly, I think a lot of administrative law scholars tend to be people who have a lot of faith in government. And if you don't, it may be that you do want to just politicize it because you don't see it as really expert. But on the other hand, if you do politicize it more and it's less effective, then you get into a very destructive cycle.
And you lose the science, which did not begin with Donald Trump's administration. Particularly the second Bush administration was full of it, and the Obama administration to a degree as well. So one of the transitions in administrative law in the 70s or 80s was from seeing government writ large as a business of expertise towards seeing it as the business of politics. And that's become more and more true. But as the areas in which government has to act have become areas to which scientific expertise is central, the FDA, to take one example that's on the front pages every day now, it seems. Loss of trust is really a terrible, loss of trust in those decisions, those outcomes is really a terrible problem. Boeing used to make its reputation worldwide from the integrity of the Federal Aviation Administration in qualifying their airframes as safe. That gets lost, Boeing gets lost.
Volker, you were.
Well, I'm
Can we turn it over to
wondering,
questions?
Jillian, whether perhaps we should stop at this
Yes.
stage, because we are all straining to ask questions. I see that there are
Let's do it.
several, and perhaps therefore, can I ask you, Jean, to mediate this and
Why don't
help us?
I can.
If people want to use the raise your hands function on, if you click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
You could also just raise your hand and I'll look through and call on you. I don't see any hands up. Okay, Connie.
I see.
You have after you get recognized, you have to unmute yourself.
Right, yeah, I wanted to come back to something that you raised, Peter, about the relationship between technology and the increase of presidential power. That was one of your, first it was the impact of technology on legal education, and then it was the impact of technology on the power of the distribution of power within the executive branch. And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, what I was saying there was that agencies have lost the capacity to tell the White House, look, we know what's what, and you have to rely on us. To the government cloud, where the White House can look over their shoulder at anything they may have. There's a certain loss of privacy involved, and so to the extent information is power, that's in relation to the White House, that's disappeared. I mean, another way to put it, or to talk about this growth, is really since the presidency of Jimmy Carter, one can take it back further than that, as the activity of making regulations has become the dominantly important activity of administrative agencies. Presidents have wanted to get involved, at least to oversee what's going on, to be able to make sure the agencies are sensibly exploring the issues, sensibly choosing what are the important issues for them to address. And there have been a series of executive orders developed by which the presidents have asserted this control through a White House office called the Office of Information and Regulatory Analysis, which is part of the Office of Management and Budget. And it's become tighter and tighter. President Trump didn't invent it by any means. Before we got to President Trump, we had presidents behaving as if they were in control of the decisions that Congress had given to agencies to make. And this goes in a way to how one thinks about the presidency in constitutional terms. Increasingly, it's being seen in what for me is a rather autocratic way. The Constitution says we have a single executive, the president. And he's to be commander-in-chief of the military. But all it says about his relationship to domestic government is that he can ask for written opinions from the people who actually have the duties. And he's to see to it that they faithfully execute the laws. And all of that happens in the agencies in relatively public, open, participatory processes. What happens inside the White House or the executive office of the presidency is quite opaque. And the more the president says, I'm in charge, and tells agencies how they are to decide, using that those opaque processes, the farther they are from Bellerophon, and the closer they are to Pegasus, I guess would be my way of putting it.
Dan?
Peter, you mentioned that Congress is the most dysfunctional of the three branches of government. What do you think would be some concrete steps that could improve the functionality of Congress?
A heart attack for Mitch McConnell. No, sorry. I don't know how they can find their way back to aisle crossing. But to have the levels of party discipline that we have now come to, which I think are very different from what were experienced in earlier times, is in a government that is not parliamentary, is really problematic. And but how does one get back to bipartisanship when the country's electors are split in the way the country's electors are split? It's very hard to say.
Jean, if I may come in, I would like Peter and Gillian to introduce a more comparative dimension into our discussion, particularly with Europe and legal traditions that you've just mentioned. And I have followed, of course, what's happening in Britain and how Boris Johnson handles government at the moment. And it's very interesting how, of course, the sort of established civil service has been a center of resistance, it seems to me, to these autocratic tendencies that you've mentioned with regard to Washington, but also, and you know, I really quite admire some of the people who have even given up their position and said, we are no longer going to tolerate this, is against our ethics. And therefore, you know, I'm wondering, I also admired the Secretary of State in Georgia, the way he handled this, because he simply insisted on the, well, administrative laws that existed, that, you know, the votes have to be counted and the results have to be announced, and whatever telephone calls Trump made didn't bother him, although he is now in deep trouble, of course, with regard to his own future. So I wonder whether you have any comments on these terrible tensions that exist and how one can get out of this.
There are times to be happy that one is past in one's 80s, which is another pessimistic thing to say, I suppose. This book by Ziblatt and Levine, is it How Democracies Die? Is a book about world developments and about the emergence of autocracies, or maybe one should say executive heavy governments worldwide. And that's a way of describing the American setting, executive heavy government. We're disposed to thinking of our government as having three branches, and putting all of the administrative apparatus into the executive branch. So now one has something like almost 2 million folks under the president, and 30, 40,000 in the judiciary, 30, 40,000 in the Congress. And how can that be an equal game? We'd be much better off if we could see the government more or less as the trunk of the tree which is in relationship with each of those three branches, but is its own independent act, has its own independence of action to some degree. And that's what you're describing in the British setting, Volker. And there are a number of American scholars who look at the civil service and see it as a potential fourth branch as well. And I suppose your admiration for those British civil servants, and for that matter, for the Secretary of State of Georgia, extends to Fiona Hill, who and other civil servants who early in the Trump administration said things that were quite unacceptable to President Trump, disloyal. And either they decided to leave government or they were forced out of government. But again, how one gets back to a setting in which the potential for resistance from the civil service is regarded as a welcome feature of government, as a constraint on arbitrariness and excessive politicization, as the action of Bellerophon and not Pegasus, I don't have an answer for that. I'll say that parliamentary systems and ours are importantly different in one respect, which is, and it's an important respect, the essential joinder of legislative and executive functions in parliamentary systems, and the independent political authority that ministers will often have, because they have their own writings, and because their agreement to what the prime minister wants to do is an essential element of the prime minister's continuance in office. And that isn't the case in our presidential system. Increasingly, one comes to understand that Boris Johnson too has a level of control over what happens within his cabinet, capacity to discipline people who don't agree with where he's going. I don't know how many of you have seen the here and now pictures of 1945, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt at the Yalta concerts, and then 1920, Putin bareback on horseback, and Donald Trump and Boris Johnson looking quite wild-eyed. It's a good time to be 80.
Alan Hyman. You're muted, Alan.
Thank you. I'm unmuted. I just wanted to express my gratitude to Professor Metzger, because your father was one of my best teachers, and what I little know about American history, I was stimulated to learn more because of your father's teaching. So I wanted to make that point. Peter and I are good friends.
Thank you.
I want to congratulate you, Peter, for your presentation today, because I never really understood what you were talking about when we were riding our bicycles together, and you were trying to explain administrative law to me. But I did have a question about the American system. We have a federal system, and we have 50, some people would call them sovereign states with their own laws and their own government. Does each state have its own administrative legal system? Or how would you characterize?
Yes, absolutely. And that variety has kept people in my line of work from having very much to do with any of those systems, just because they vary so much from place to place. One of the ways in which they vary is they typically do not have the same concentration of authority in one political executive figure. They have elected attorneys general. They have elected controllers. They have maybe elected public utility boards. And these are consequently dispersed executives, so that you don't have quite the same issues of concentration as you can have in the federal context. There are commonalities. The making of regulations subordinate to statutes is a universal phenomenon in the states, in cities for that matter, in the United States, in the European Union, in Britain, in Swaziland. Anywhere you go, you will find that statutes are not the end of lawmaking in today's governments. Secondary legislation, as it's called, regulations, what we call regulations, are universal. In the states, as at the federal level, there are individualistic disputes that need to be decided, and not all of them are decided in courts. Some of them are decided before administrative bodies. At the federal level, the administrative bodies that reach those decisions are all subordinate to the particular agency that is concerned with them. Environmental issues get tried before the EPA. Labor issues get tried before the NLRB or the Department of Labor, depending on what kind of labor issue they are. In the states, often, not always, but often, there are external central bodies of administrative law judges who handle the disputes that come up before every agency. But in the states also, governments tend to be much smaller and often rather amateur. North Carolina, I think at one point, had 40 different agencies regulating professions. Well drillers, as well as barbers and doctors and the like. And for each of those professions, there was a quasi-governmental body acting officially, but with members who were part-time members, because most of the time they were well drillers, or doctors, or dentists, or barbers, or whatever. And so the capacity to have disputes that might come up involving individual interests, involving one of those bodies, be heard by an external, independent trier of fact, could be quite important.
Dean, I'm wondering, do you have many questions in front of you still? And could you bundle them? Because we've been going on for quite some time now, and our speakers will be exhausted quite soon.
We have two people I see. Heidi?
Question. Since the bipartisan system at the present time is dysfunctional, do you think it is time for a third party? And would a third party even have a chance to make any changes, such as a non-Trumpian Republican Party?
Well, we're back. I mean, at the national level, of course, we're back to the 50 states that Alan was speaking of, and what we know about the politics of the 50 states. I mean, each of us have seen the maps or understand the trends, and it isn't a two-party system in every state. It isn't realistically a two-party system in every state. There are blue states and there are red states, and what the emergence of a third party might very well do is weaken strengths that we look for. I mean, is a third party in New York going to attract Democrats, or is it going to attract Republicans? I take it would have its, so maybe we should root for having third parties in red states.
Right.
Okay.
David? I think it's the last question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very stimulating conversation and raises a lot of questions in my mind. I'm not sure if I have this quote correct, but was it President Johnson who said that it's important to find the right thing to do, but you have to find the right thing. And the other thought is about the people. We all remember the radio program, The Shadow. What evil lurks in the hearts of men? Only the shadow knows. Only the shadow knows when somebody walks into the voting booth and pulls the lever. So here we are with where Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison would probably turn over in their graves to find out what's going on with the people. And even in the press, when I read an article many times, it's not carefully explained. For example, does President Biden have the right to waive the rights in this issue with the drug companies? What's happening in public health? 60 years ago, the medical schools, and Professor Stoneman could tell me, were teaching public health in a different way when there was a pandemic. I mean, now it's totally the opposite. What do we do in an administrative way to address these issues of the people, the right of does the president have the right to do these things? And particularly, what's going on in public health administratively?
I certainly can't get to the last of those. As to does the president have the right to do these things, I imagine Pfizer or Moderna or one of those folks whose valuable interests in royalties would be interfered with by a waiver will either agree to let the president do that and disputes can be settled, or we'll go to court and we'll find an answer in legal terms to the question. But the first part of your observation reminded me of another impact of the digital age, the smartphones and the like, which is an impact on bipartisanship. We have so much capacity now to choose the news sources that we care to deal with. And there are, for that matter, so great a variety of news sources that our social capacity to learn from one another, the possibility of trends towards moderation is sharply diminished. I mean, it's I think well established that when people of similar political persuasions get together and talk about things, they move farther to the right or to the left, and we see that, I think, going on in American society today. One of my favorite empirical studies, which I've used in class to try and persuade students that it isn't all political, was a study of decision-making in the federal courts of appeal. That using data, one of the really important things that's going on is we have much more data and much more capacity to learn from it than we ever did when we were children. So they looked at decisions in the courts of appeals as against the president appointing the judges who were on the panels. And if you had 3 Republican judges or 3 Democrat judges, and you compared the results in similar cases for 3 Republican judges or 3 Democrat judges, there were distinct differences, statistically significant differences. The Republicans were to the right and the Democrats were to the left. If there were 2 Republican judges and 1 Democrat, or 2 Democrat judges and 1 Republican, no difference. There was no observable difference, although the 2 Democrats, their votes were entitled to prevail. 2 Republicans, their votes were entitled to prevail. Why not the same result? The moderating power of conversation between people of different views. And to some extent, we're losing that.
Mhm.
Volker, can I just say something before you close this?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, both Jillian and Peter, for extraordinary conversation. I have to be a little more optimistic because having been fighting my whole life for veterans and Agent Orange, honestly, I didn't see Trump doing anything that Reagan hadn't done way better and way more successfully. No, seriously, in shutting down CDC studies, in making sure studies were not done, in stymieing everything, and for which the veterans hadn't recovered yet. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing is just more of the same. And I have such an opposite view of the internet. And now I can say I monitor a lot of veteran sites, and these aren't highly educated people, but they have a world open to them, and they have access open to them. They have records open to them. They can talk to one another in a way that, you know, we're of the index cards in the library generation, and these people can go in a half an hour, do what would have taken us a month if we had access to begin with. So
That's the plus side, no doubt about it.
and so I can't be, you know, I just think that the government has always, you know, like when you were at the NRC and I was at the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union, we didn't think that much that the NRC was the world's greatest, and then it was the AEC was the world's greatest agency. So I guess I'm not ready to give up on America yet. Thank you.
Before you close, Volker, I just want to take the chance to thank my colleague, Jillian, for being willing to take time out of what I know is an extraordinarily busy and demanding day.
Thank you so much.
Well, indeed, I was very intrigued how we moved from administrative law to politics and ultimately to philosophy now and ethics. And that's, I think, the range of things that we should be interested in. I found this very illuminating. And so Peter and Jillian, thank you very, very much for this wonderful conversation. Using a glass that I've next to me here to drink to your health and to the successful epic future that Jean is going to tell us about. Perhaps, I think you said that there might be actually some kind of an event towards the end of the semester.
The Columbia rules are very, very strict about us getting together, even though I'm sure we're all vaccinated. So we've decided to put off the provost's reception until we could actually be with one another. And luckily, Dan Ties was able to talk to Magdalena, whose last name is the director of music, who's going to do a special concert for us on May 25th, which should be wonderful. And as soon as the rules change and we can get together, we will. But the university still has us limited to 10 people. So, but we'll do. This has been working out as well as I think could be expected, given.
This is one of the real benefits of Zoom, actually.
I would like to thank all of you for participating, and we've gone on for almost an hour and a half, so it's about time, I think, that we say goodbye, and we'll wait to hear from you, Jean, about our next event. And in the meantime, thank you, and thank Diana also for setting this up for us. It was really a very good experience. So I'll say goodbye to all of you. Goodbye. See you soon.
All right. Thanks so much.